a paper by Clare, Saunders, and Roth. Today we have Silke with us. Environmental direct action and civilly disobedient lobbying in historical variable contexts. The cases of anti-roads in 1992 to 97 and climate change from 2019 to 24 activism.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for organizing this brilliant conference. I'm so happy to be here, and Claire is really, really sad not to be here. And Claire is the first author of this presentation, so I will do my best to represent us well enough. This presentation is coming out and develops further some of the ideas in our book, Organizing for Change, in particular, the chapters on the big picture and another chapter that looks at tactics. And the tactics that we discuss in the book are not just direct action, they're actually only a small part of it. We also look at service provision and advocacy. So, and I hope that becomes clearer in the presentation, and you tell me when I have to shut up. Yeah? So, what we do in this presentation, but also in the book, is to the interaction between different social, political, and cultural contexts, how they interact with one another, how they affect political action, but also how the contexts are affected by such actions. And so this distinction between success and outcomes is really important to us in our thinking, because there are so many unintended consequences of direct action or any other tactics. And what I perhaps should also say, I'm a sociologist. I consider myself a political sociologist. Clare is a political scientist. And in both sociology and political science, when one looks at social movements, the historical dimension does not always receive as much attention as we think it needs. So we have in our book developed this notion of historically variable contexts, and in the presentation I will talk about other contexts which are more often used in social movement scholarships. And we want to illustrate our thinking with these two different time periods in which, on the one hand, we talk about direct action, and on the other hand, civilly disobedient lobbying. And to some extent, that relates to what we heard this morning about different forms of direct action. And so I hope there is resonance, but not too much overlap. So first, to very briefly summarize that, what Claire and I were always frustrated with was the siloing between these debates about social movements, voluntary organizations, and non-governmental organizations, which are usually discussed in different disciplines with different concepts, and overlook that if you look into what activists do, there is actually a lot of overlap, and direct action is also not necessarily so distinct from service delivery and advocacy. And so we try to bring all these together and see, so obviously there are differences in terms of what kind of tactics these different types of organizations use, but we also see a lot of interaction. And we want to bring that together. And for that, we have then, on the one hand, developed this notion of the historically variable contexts, but then we also, rather than talking about social movement organizations, we talk about social change organizations, because civil society organizations or NGOs do not necessarily perceive themselves as social movement organizations or are perceived as such. And we also talk about social change makers rather than activists or volunteers, because activists do not necessarily identify as activists. Some do, but others don't. And we think that this, to talk about social change makers opens up the debate and hopefully also results in more collaboration. So the concepts then also direct action. We talk about direct action in this paper, and this is basically we talk about direct action in the book, but we develop this further here in this paper, and that needs also further development. So this is kind of a draft. Is to directly intervene. So, for example, if there is another role if there is a expansion of an airport, or there is a site that needs to be shut down, that is what we refer to as direct action. And the civilly disobedient lobbying, we refer to occupations, for example, of a city center in order to draw attention to climate change. So it's there are different intentions with these two different types of occupations or protest actions. And now we come to to explain why we talk about historically variable contexts and not political opportunity structures. Those who are familiar with the social movement literature will know that Sidney Tarrow's concept, not just Sidney Tarrow, but he is famously associated with the notion of political opportunity structures, focuses very much to what extent actors can find allies among the state, to what extent protest is tolerated or not. We have talked about that this morning. To what extent protesters are repressed or not. And we do not contest that this is all extremely important, but we find it is somewhat limited because it focuses very much on the state and overlooks other forms of repression that are not related to the state. It seems to be a bit static. And then later on, people have hijacked the notion of the political opportunities and attached it to all different kinds, discursive opportunity structures and what have you. So we therefore say, yes, it's a very inspiring and important concept, but perhaps there's something better out there. Then we also looked at the notion of arenas and fields and multi-institutional politics, and they, in contrast to the political structure, opportunity structures or political opportunities concept, they are broader because they also include corporations, broader cultures, schools, local authorities. But then there are still questions about how does one delineate them? And we have listed here some, to what extent do they enable consensual or contentious action? How strategic and cultural are actions in these various fields. And yes, we agree to some extent with them, but then we find perhaps the arenas are a little bit too flexible in the contrast to the opportunity structures. Then we look also at socio-technical transitions, but this is very much associated with sustainability initiatives. It has so far not been adapted to other contexts of conflict. And as you can see, it is very, very complex, including a range of different aspects of markets, industries, policies that explain how change comes about. So again, inspiring. And we draw on all of these inspirations, but we like to talk about historical variable contexts. And what we want to emphasize on the one hand is that the context is both shaping the direct action or other tactics, as well as being shaped by. And so we look then at how social change comes about through the interaction between these social change organizations and the social change makers, and take into consideration a number of different or a wide range of regime types, not just political, but also gender and welfare and economic regimes, cultural norms and technologies. And it's really important that civil society and local conditions play as much a role as the state. And at this point, you might ask us, why don't you talk about conjunctures and Gramsci and Stuart Hall? And the answer is we have to think more about that. So we are parking this for the moment. And instead, we are moving on to our case studies. And so the first context that we are looking at is in the early 1990s. There is a conservative government under Major. So it's post-Thatcher, but pre-Blair. The situation in the UK is characterized with high youth unemployment, but at that point, still a benefit system that supports countercultural development. A strong link between partying and politics, reclaiming the streets, some repression, but also the repression contributing to mobilization, because as we know, repression can repress mobilization, it can also emphasize it. And a large road building scheme. And at that point, protesters were able to engage in disruptive action despite the resistance of more conservative, more polite campaigners. And so here in this direct action that we discuss in this context are using bodies to disrupt the situation through the physical presence. We see that later on also, supported by listserv. So this is early forms of digital action or hybridity between online and offline action. It's intense work of building trust and mobilizing uneasy alliances, but the ability to bring different milieus together. And I mean, that is always very important, to what extent one can build bridges between different types of activists or milieus. And the goal to halt road building. And then when we move to the end of the 2010s, or this time period 2018 to 2020, again, a conservative government. It's a little last bit of Theresa May and then Boris Johnson. At that time period, it was already decided that the UK would leave the European Union, and overall a shift to the right, austerity measures, high student fees. So in that regard, less support for countercultural tendencies. Here also repression, but repression that prevents mobilization or constrains it much more, a dismantling of green frameworks, and a relative normalization of the climate emergency context. Also a failure of protecting the climate, and in this time period, organizations like Extinction Rebellion are engaging in what we call civilly disobedient lobbying, because yes, it is also an occupation of public space, but it is an occupation of public space in order to draw attention to the issue, to some extent shut down movement in London, to provoke arrests, avoid mobilization. But in terms of the protesters or change makers involved in these protests, less cross-class mobilization, but more middle-class people in these groups, drawing attention to the issue among the wider public, but also the government, and also calling for more democracy in the making of climate policy. So here we come back to the topic of the conference. So we therefore compare these two time periods, which are characterized by these different types of action. And what we describe in the book is also that the choice of tactics is very much informed not only by the historical variable context, but also by the values or taste of tactics of the change makers and change organizations, and of course also the goals, and whether these goals are actually achieved is another matter. So the direct action is associated with a specific goal, preventing something to be built or something to be shut down, whereas with civilly disobedient lobbying, it is the broader goal of bringing attention to climate change. In the first case, we have a diverse movement, and diverse movements cross class and otherwise inclusive movements are always more successful. And on the other hand, a more homogeneous movement on the other hand in the second time period. And the third difference that in the first case, the repression increases mobilization, whereas in the second case, wonderful, thank you. The repression is limiting mobilization. And I'm good in time, so because I'm already coming to the conclusion. So what I already said before, the contexts are shaping goals, the cultures, the choice of tactics, as well as the relationship between the repression and mobilization. And what we did in this paper here is looking at one country in a very short time period. What we did in the book is we looked at three threats. So on the one hand, a threat in terms of racial capitalism, starting from colonialism to the Black Lives Matter movement, to socialism, up to neoliberalism, and fascism, to contemporary far-right movements. So we discussed several centuries in order to show these broad developments. And what I would really like to see, and I don't know whether we can do that, whether Claire and I will do that, or I certainly hope other people will do that, is to look at the current solidarity movement with Palestine and Gaza, and look at that in different historical contexts and compare the debate and the repression that is going on in Germany to how it is discussed in the UK, in Ireland, in Spain, and look at these various histories of fascism and democracy, how that shapes the support for speaking out on Palestine or not. And that is my conclusion for now. So
we have an extra minute and a half for questions. Does anyone want to start?
Thanks for the interesting talk. I can imagine it was the research on this, which, yeah, is just interesting, I guess. And I have thought maybe also maybe at the first things you said, when it comes to the term activist, you said the very interesting formulation that activists often do not define themselves as activists, which is of course very important for how to shape the research, how to interact with persons. And you have a social change makers, if I get it right. You are with that working town, as I get it right. And I was thinking about because my perception is that this term activist was brought out more and more over the last years. It wasn't like for 10 or 20 or 30 years or that this description was used so much. It is a label out of our time, which is not just taken by people who are social change makers, but also labeled on them by the media, by journalists and so on. That for me it is interesting because I think activism or something that seems then to be a specific way of action for specific group of persons instead of persons who empower themselves and enable themselves to act politically the way they think it is right. And yeah, so I wonder what you think about this term or how it is used or how you are dealing with that labeling that is going on with that.
Okay, so I mean, what I said earlier in the talk was that the book is not building only this direct action and protest, because we think that it is really, really important to look at service provision and advocacy as very important tactics to bring about social change. And people who are in voluntary organizations delivering services to, I don't know, the elderly, people who are incapacitated in any ways, they would not necessarily identify themselves as activists, and the literature would also not write about them as activists. They would write about them as volunteers. And the point was that because so the other thing I need to say, so Clare's expertise is very much the environmental movement. We have together worked on Occupy, and we have also written papers together on the women's movement, but my background is more trade unions, labor movement, women's movement, humanitarianism, development. So we bring together expertise from different areas, but we have very similar views on how to talk about that. And because we grappled with these different literatures, we found that some literatures talk about the activists, others not at all, but we found that these other literatures who do not talk about activists are just as important. But on the other hand, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there is a quite prominent article which has the title "I'm not an activist, but," yeah, where the interviewees talk about that they do not achieve this ideal. Yeah, they are not as so, because it's also a very gender concept. Yeah, how male these activists are who are taking risks. Yeah, and so there are a number of reasons why the term can simply be problematic, because people think activists, they are on the left, or activists, they are militant. And I'm not on the left, or I'm not militant, and therefore I'm not an activist. Yeah, so the thing is like, on the one hand, that people feel they are not meeting an ideal, or they don't want to associate with the term. And therefore and on the other hand, when we talk about volunteers, which of course we can say, so also not everybody is a volunteer, some people are staff members, yeah. We were simply looking for a term that is very inclusive, and we didn't want to use the term agent, so that is why we settled on makers. Yes.
Just a quick question about if they didn't identify themselves. I mean, I think the historical context is really interesting because it's a great framework. But just on the back of that question there of identity, I can quite see why they wouldn't think of themselves as activists. Not everyone has to do that, especially if you're working for a voluntary association or organization. Do they, in your research, did the concept of citizenship come up, that they were doing their active duty as a citizen in the same way as you might, let's say, vote. There are other ways of being city, showing that, doing citizenship. Is that something that came up at all in your?
That depends on the project. So the thing is like this is we draw on about 20 different projects that we did either separately or together. And so it really depends then on the context, whether people use these other terms. But yes, absolutely, one can talk about citizenship. But again, that is context dependent.
I'm sorry,
Sure.
I didn't even say who I was.
Oh,
The name is Pushpa, and I'm based at a university called University in Birmingham. Sorry.
Right.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else?
Ellen.
Hi.
Yes. I happen to know someone who is really played a pivotal role in that when we playing the streets and also the anti-drugs movement and so forth. And when you're bringing forward the idea of this remarkable fusion of people of different backgrounds and classes coming together, could you talk about what created that movie? It wasn't necessarily the cause. Was it not the fact that there was a physical threat to people's lives due to going into the road?
Okay, so I'm afraid that is a question for Claire rather than for me, because she did this piece of research on the environmental movement. But I did a study on an organization called the Coalition of Labor Union Women that formed in the United States in Chicago in 1974, and it still exists. And that organization, that was my doctoral dissertation, I developed the notion of a bridging organization. And there are organizations that bridge different movements. So in that case, it was a bridge between the trade unions and the women's movement. And so while I really pass on this question to Claire, is that Claire also in her work on climate camps, she has also discussed these principles of bridge building and bridge makers that are, and when we did the research on Occupy together, we also found there were people who came from so many different backgrounds. There were some who had been at Greenland Common, and others had been at climate camps, and others had never been active because they were appalled and alienated from groups like the Socialist Worker Party. So others came from the church. So the point is then, my answer would be there are individuals or organizations who are able to build bridges between these different cultures, and then and that is also why these terms are so important to us, because it is about bringing people together. And that also means that, and I think again, coming back to Gaza, because I think we just have to talk about it as much as possible, is rather than have a polarization where people cannot talk to one another because one finds that people are too extreme on the one or the other side, that one starts to listen to one another and develops positions that are inclusive and tolerant, and even if one doesn't agree, remains in conversation. So that's how I can answer that.
Any time for one more quick question?
Yes. Hello, I'm Goran again. I missed the first part of the presentation, but have you looked at framing for these different groups and framing they used for them to reach different coalitions and bring people in?
Not in the talk. Not in the research, yes, but in this talk we don't discuss framing processes.
Thank you, everyone.